Forget frequently asked questions.
Common sense, common knowledge, or Google.
How about advice from a real genius? 95% of people in any profession are good enough to be qualified and licensed. 5%
go above and beyond.
They become very good at what they do, but only
0.1%
are real geniuses. Richard Jacobs has made it his life's mission to find them for you. He hunts down and interviews geniuses in every field: sleep science, cancer, stem cells, ketogenic diets, and more. Here come the geniuses. This is the Finding Genius Podcast
with Richard Jacobs.
Quick note before we begin, the Finding Genius Foundation, as part of the Finding Genius Podcast, has recently completed a book about understanding viruses. So the creation of this book was to interview 100 virologists, ask them a lot of deep, difficult questions, take the most difficult questions, and then re-interview the top 25 or so and ask them the hardest questions I could think of. And we compiled that all into a book. So you'll see question and 4 or 5 experts' answers. Question, 4 or 5 experts' answers. There's about 30 questions in the book. I think it's a great read for the layperson and for the researcher. It talks about a lot of speculation in the world of viruses, such as are they alive or not, and why is it important? Why do viruses go latent or hidden or ineffective or sit in a person or an animal or another creature for weeks, months, years, and then suddenly become virulent and affect that person? So there's a lot of really provocative questions in the book. It's now on Amazon. So if you go to Amazon and type in Finding Genius, you'll see the book on viruses. It's also on Kindle. The Audible version is in production and should be ready in approximately a month. But if you want to go and order it now, you can do so again by going to Amazon or Kindle, or go to findinggeniusfoundation.org and go to publications. There's an opportunity as well to get the transcripts of all the interviews and to hear the original interviews themselves. If we put them all together, the book would be about 1,000 pages, but we condensed them down to make it juicy and concise and tight and very interesting. So I hope you'll check out the book. We're now working on one about cancer, but this is going to be our goal is 3 times a year to come out with these masterclass books that I think will inspire new scientific research, and I hope you'll check it out. Thank you.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Finding Genius Podcast, now part of the Finding Genius Foundation. I have Chris Stringer. He's a research leader in human evolution, part of the Natural History Museum, and we're going to talk about various topics in human evolution. So, Chris, thanks for coming.
It's a pleasure to be with you.
Yeah. So what's your current work like? Tell me about it.
Well, obviously, it's been an unusual year with the COVID lockdown, so I've hardly been in my place of work. I've mostly been working from home, but it has meant that I can get to write up a lot of stuff that's been lying around for a while. So actually, in terms of writing, quite productive. And just this year, since January, we've published 3 papers. So I published a review paper with 3 geneticists and an archaeologist about the origin of modern humans. I published a paper on some teeth from Jersey, which are probably about 45,000 years old and which show an interesting combination of Neanderthal and modern human features, possibly signs of hybridization between them. And just a paper has come out looking at the issue of southern Denisovans, so the mystery people which seem to have been living in East Asia, to bred with the ancestors of modern native population, Papua New Guinea and Australia, but we don't have clear fossil evidence. So I was on a paper discussing where the fossils might be of these people and more evidence of the interbreeding.
Are there no fossils of Denisovans at all, or just not that are in intermediate interbred form with Neanderthals or Homo sapiens?
Well, yes. So the known fossils of Denisovans, the first ones, very fragmentary, were found in Denisova Cave in Siberia. And there we've got a finger bone and a few teeth and a bit of a skull. And then there's a jawbone from the Tibetan Plateau of China, which also seems to Denisovan. And that's the real hard evidence of them. But of course, we've got a lot of DNA data and also from the caves that these people were occupying. But the weird thing is that the biggest amount of their DNA today is not found in Siberia or China. It's found in places like Australia and New Guinea. So this is a puzzle. And the guess is that they must have had a related population living down in Southeast Asia, perhaps even on the islands, places away, Borneo and so on. And we don't have those. Or some people suspect we might have the fossils already, but we're misidentified because we know there were ancient people in the region. So the ancient species Homo erectus was living on Java until about 100,000 years ago. And then there's these weird dwarfs that we've learnt about in years, and Flores, Homo floresiensis, Hobbit, and on Luzon in the Philippines, more fragmentary material of something called Homo luzonensis. And these seem to be dwarf species that are quite primitive. So in my view, none of those, they're all too primitive, too different from us and Neanderthals to represent Denisovans. We do know about, they're closely related. Those things that we know about in East Asia, they're much more primitive. So I don't think they're Denisovans. Some people think maybe we've got it wrong and the Denisovans are one of those populations, but I doubt it.
Well, how many major humanoid populations are there, and what differentiates them?
Well, yes, it depends what time period we're talking about, but even within the last 100,000 years, there were at least 5 kinds of humans on Earth, I think probably 6. So we had been evolving in Europe and Asia. We had the Neanderthal lineage. Over in the Far East, there's the Denisovans, as I mentioned, and then down in East Asia, potentially Homo erectus surviving, Homo floresiensis, and Homo luzonensis. So that's at least 5 or 6. And the weird thing, and one of the issues that I'm addressing, and all of us are trying to address in this time period, is what happened to those others? Were the only humans left on the planet Earth when there was all this diversity not too long ago?
What was the last species apart from us? Was it Neanderthals that faded out?
Well, we don't know the answer to that for sure. So we think the Neanderthals long until about 4 ago. It looks like Floresiensis was still on Flores 50,000 years ago, but we don't know how much longer. Homo luzonensis, the known fossils are maybe 60 or 70,000 years old. We don't know. And the Denisovans, well, they seem to have been around at least 45,000. Again, we don't know when they disappeared. So probably some of these people lasted at least until 40,000 years ago. Some people suspect the Denisovans lasted even longer in Ireland, Southeast Asia, but we don't know that.
So does it seem like 40 to 50,000 years ago, there was a sudden drop off in all of these other types of humans except Homo sapiens?
Well, that's right. And so obviously this implicates maybe Homo sapiens in the... We think that modern humans made their main exit from Africa about 60,000 years ago, and then they began to spread inevitably into the territory of these other humans. And so there was a coexistence period, at least for some of them, certainly for us and Neanderthal Denisovans, because there was interbreeding, so we must have coexisted with them, and they disappeared after. So, did we kill them off either purposefully or sort of because we hunted the same animals and collected food to live in the best resources, best areas? Did we compete with, and thus they sort of died out because of competition from. There's even a view that for the Neanderthals, we kind of absorbed to bred with, kind of mopped them up, and hence they disappeared by being integrated in a much bigger modern human population. So in that sense, the Neanderthals and Denisovans haven't gone extinct wholesale. Physically, they've disappeared, but of course their DNA lives on in modern.
Yeah, and people today, some have Neanderthal DNA, but do any of them have Denisovan or any of these other types of humanoid DNAs?
Well, yes. So the paper we published earlier this week, we were looking at the question of Denisovan DNA over in Ireland, Southeast Asia, places like Guinea and Stacey and so on. And we were able to confirm what other people had found, that Denisovan DNA is widespread in Southeast. It's present in low levels in much of Eastern Asia and over in the Americas in Native Americans, but it's there at a much higher level, maybe 3 or 4% in people in places Papua New Guinea and Native Australian. And that's on top of having Neanderthals. So the scenario looks most likely that when modern humans made this first exit 60,000 years ago, obviously they first of all Southwest Asia, and then the populations that eventually ended up in Australia and New Guinea, their ancestors headed across Southern Asia and then down through Southeast. So in Southwest Asia, they first of all picked up Neanderthal, which is widespread everywhere. We have it, Europeans have it at about 2%. And then these populations that headed to New Guinea and Australia, they then had a second phase of interbreeding with the Denisovans, and that got added into them. So they have 2 lots of interbreeding, first with Neanderthal ancestors and then with Denisovans. And we also investigated whether there might be signs of interbreeding with these other more archaic lines, Homo erectus, floresiensis, Homo luzonensis. But my geneticist colleagues could find no evidence of more ancient signs of interbreeding of a more ancient population. So it's only Neanderthal and Denisovan that have got the interbreeding in that region. In Africa, there's also potentially some interbreeding there with an unknown archaic species, possibly an earliest Homo heidelbergensis, had survived in Africa and was interbreeding with modern humans in sub-Saharan Africa as well. So basically interbreeding with our close relatives is something that seems to have happened widely within modern humans. So we're not 100% recent African origin, which is what I've told you, say 15 or 20 years ago, more or less 100% recent African origin. We've got a bit of the genomes of these other earlier species added in.
Is there evidence, I guess there is, of people crossing some of the oceans 50,000 years ago to reach certain areas they otherwise couldn't?
Before we continue, I've been personally funding the Finding Genius podcast for 4.5 years now, which has led to 2,700 plus interviews of clinicians, researchers, scientists, CEOs, and other amazing people who are working to advance science and improve our lives and our world. Even though this podcast gets 100,000 plus downloads a month, we need your help to reach hundreds of thousands more worldwide. Please visit findinggeniuspodcast.com and click on Support Us. We have 3 levels of membership from $10 to $49 a month, including perks such as the ability to see ahead in our interview calendar and ask questions of upcoming guests, transcripts of podcasts you're interested in, the ability to request specific topics or guests, and more. Visit findinggeniuspodcast.com and click Support Us today. Now back to the show.
That's right. So, so thinking of island Southeast Asia, so today, of course, places Borneo and so on and Java are separate islands at times of low sea level. So when the ice caps were large, as they often were in the ice ages, a couple of million years, the sea level dropped, and sometimes it dropped over 100 meters, all the water that was locked in these enlarged ice caps. And so the sea level fell, and at times like that, Java was connected to the rest of Southeast Asia and human population to cross. Now, that was never true for New Guinea and Australia. Those areas were always cut off from Southeast Asia. So there are a chain of islands leading New Guinea and Australia, but those were never million years or so. So for modern humans to end up in Australia and New Guinea, they must have had watercraft to get there. They must have had intentional sea crossing, some kind of boats, even though we've got no actual evidence of the having boat. The fact they got to Australia means they must have had them, and they must have had them 45 or 50,000 years to make those.
Yeah, that's amazing that they would have been on the ocean that long ago. That's really crazy.
It is amazing. And even further back, of course, there's the situation of Homo floresiensis. So this primitive with an ape-sized brain, that somehow ended up on Flores, which is also an isolated island way beyond Java. And we don't know how it looks like primitive humans on Flores a million years ago, potentially the ancestor Homo. So I find it difficult to think they had boats that far back in time. It is possible, but also possible is that you get accidental raft. You get tsunamis in the region, and you think of that tsunami maybe 10 years ago, that massive tsunami from a volcanic event. These happen quite frequently in the area, tectonically very active, and animals can be picked up and spread on rafts. So after that tsunami about 10 years ago, people were found out at sea more than 100 miles from where they started, a week later on rafts of vegetation. So that's in the last 10 years. When you're talking about timescales of hundreds of thousands of years, very rare and special events actually can happen, and you can have populations moving, and that's how some species have crossed over to them. I think that Homo floresiensis may well have ended up rafted on vegetation by a tsunami and somehow ended.
Can we determine the phenotype, what these different humanoids would look like? Because I've seen renderings of Neanderthals. I don't know how accurate they are, but they appear to be, very close to us, a broader nose, different jaw, chest, and everything. So
obviously we've got well-preserved Neanderthal fossils, so we know pretty well how they would have looked, at least in overall appearance, in their body shape and their muscles. They were a great big rib cage, lungs in there. They had a face which was different from ours. It had a big nose that forwards, not much of a chin, a brow ridge over the eyes, and that's very common with these more ancient species to have a big brow ridge, a receding forehead, but a big brain and a brain case longer and lower, a different shape to it. So physically, they would have looked different. And of course, what we can't tell is the details of their covering. We think that their skin color might have been not white, but it would have been a relatively pale skin, probably in Europe. But we don't know much about their hair color. I think most data suggests actually their hair color was really dark. But how much body hair they had like that, we haven't got any idea. And so a reconstruction can show them as being very hairy and they won't look very human, or it can make them, you'll see a range of reconstructions in the literature. If you go to museums, you will see some reconstructions that make the Neanderthals look in some cases, they're almost heroic, very noble population. And in others, you'll see them a bit dirtier and a bit scruffy. So, there is this element of unknown about they really have been human. They walked upright, as well as we do. They were technically very capable, but they were more heavily muscled. They'd been on a different evolution of several 100,000 years. So they weren't just, in my view, another version of us. They were more distinct. For the Denisovans, because we've got such fragmentary fossils.
If you like this podcast, please click the link in the description to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
We don't know. We know that they were related to us and the Neanderthals, so they pretty certainly had big brain. They have big molar teeth. We know that from the surviving fossil, but otherwise we know very little about them. So this is one of the intriguing things. We can look forward in the next years, hopefully, to the recovery of much more Denisovan fossils to tell us how they related and the Neanderthals.
Is there like a rarity scale of fossils available at that time period? Can you tell? Was there any big climatic, climate change events or climate events, or what was going on at that time period, and what do you think there's the number of fossils that there are?
Yeah, sure. So obviously the fossils we have, preservation varies greatly. There are some environments which we know preserve fossils very well. So caves are very good. So they act like traps. Things fall into the caves and preserved. And also we know that an area like East Africa is excellent because you've got a rifting going on there. The East End is opening up. And you get these sedimentary basins of rivers and lakes, and they also are very good for preserving fossils. So those are good places to look for. But there are many other areas. So, for example, deserts, you get a lot of erosion and very dry conditions. They usually will not preserve fossils well. Rainforest, so certain places where fossils will stand a better chance of first of all deposited, and then you've got to hope that the local conditions are good for their preservation. So there is a variation. European caves have been very good to yield up fossils. Some river sites have been very good for yielding up fossils. But open country areas, much more difficult to find fossils in those areas. And of course, temperature conditions are also crucial. So if you've got a place like Denisovan, there you've got remarkable preservation because that area was very cold. And therefore, you've not only got good bone preservation, the DNA are wonderfully preserved, and that unfortunately is not in tropical and subtropical areas. Conditions are very bad for across the world. And of course, it's also a measure of where people have. So people have, of course, concentrated in Africa on the Rift Valley sites in places like Kenya, Ethiopia, and they've looked at the cave sites in South Africa to a certain extent in places like Morocco, but maybe 90% of the African continent has still not yielded a single for the time period we're talking. So there's a huge amount that's still unknown. And then when you look to a huge area like Asia, and when you look at all those islands in Southeast, really very few fossils from a big area too. So we really only have still, I think, very incomplete of the diversity of these early humans, and there will be many more exciting discoveries to come as people open up some of these areas that are so far unexplored.
What about the hobbit creature that you mentioned? Why is it called that, and what does it look like?
Well, yeah. So when it was published in 2004, of course, there'd been the Hobbit films were very popular. So it was very small-bodied. So this individual, the most skeleton, is of a female individual, and she's only just over a meter tall. So she got the nickname Hobbit, and that name has stuck. And we have other fossils from the site, and all of them are small-bodied. So we're talking about a very small-bodied creature with a small head, quite a small brain, say an ape, say not a human, small teeth, but quite a robust jaw and some weird body proportions. So very short legs and very long arms, great big feet. So strange looking, very huge, probably if we could have seen it. Homo luzonensis, that also was small-bodied from the small teeth, but it also seems to have curved hand and foot bones, suggesting that it may have retained an ability to climb in the trees. So again, that may not have been human.
Yeah, wow. Are any of these humanoid variations closer to an ape ancestor than we are? Can you tell?
It doesn't look like it. So it looks like all of these variants that have evolved within the last, let's say, 2 million years. So the estimates of when we split from closest living relatives to the chimpanzees. So we seem to have split from their lineage 7 million years ago. So we and Floresiensis, these other ones I've talked about, are evolutionary products of 2 million years or so. So, we're all relatively closely related. And a lot of those original ape features of common ancestor have been lost in that time. So all of the things I've talked about walked upright in some fashion, maybe a little bit differently. Floresiensis has some primitive features, may not have walked entirely as we do, and certainly Floresiensis and Luzonensis may have spent the trees from some features in there, but they were not ape-like in the sense of being similar to that common many millions of years ago. So they were human in that sense. I mean, we classified them in the genus Homo, so for me that means I call them human. Some people differ in that. Some people think that it's only our own species that are human. I take of that anything Homo, and that includes us, Neanderthals, Denisovans, Homo erectus, Homo heidelbergensis, Floresiensis, Luzonensis. They're all within the genus Homo, so I would call them all human. Some people think that there are enough primitive features in Floresiensis and Luzonensis to hint that they might be part of a very early, and that they did not come from Homo erectus ancestors did, but they might actually come from a slightly earlier. About that, I think it's still an open question. Unfortunately, as I mentioned, we're not likely DNA from the warm conditions in the cave sites, but work is progressing on protein fossil bones, and it's possible that if we can get proteins which often survive better from those fossils, they also will help us relate to us, to the Neanderthals, and to each other. And that's work which is ongoing.
Yeah, what would you expect? How would you expect to recount human evolution if we had more data? And what does more data mean?
Yeah, I think it will show a lot more diversity. I think that the species we know about within the last million years are only a sample of what was out there. So even the Denisovan, the interesting thing is that the Denisovans we know about from Siberia did not provide the same population that interbred with the ancestors of the people in, for example, New Guinea, Australia. The Denisovans that were in Ireland, Southeast Asia, that interbred with the ancestors of Australian Aborigine and New Guineans, they were a different branch of Denisovans that had split probably several 100,000 years from them. So even the Denisovan lineage, when we get more fossils, is probably going to show a lot, probably more than modern humans, probably more than. So that's still to be discovered. And I haven't had a chance to talk about something strange from Africa called Homo naledi. Now, this is a species that's recently been discovered from Rising Star Cave near Johannesburg in South Africa. And this is a species which is really quite primitive, in many ways as primitive as Homo erectus or even something like Homo habilis, very early. And yet that creature was still around in South Africa about 300,000 years. And that's really so we can account for the hobbit's survival on Flores because of the isolation of it. Somehow it got there early on, maybe more than 1 million years ago, and then evolved in splendid isolation for maybe 1 million years, with nothing kind of get in its way and threaten it with extinction. But in South Africa, where we think that modern humans had been developing for several 100,000 years, there was another evolved species, Homo heidelbergensis, in parts of Africa. How did Homo naledi, again, an ape-sized brain and quite a primitive skeleton, how did that survive in southern Africa at least until 300,000 years ago? And it may well have gone on after. So that's a big mystery. How could that have survived there? And what's its evolutionary history? Where did it? We don't know anything about it as well. I think that's a reflection, as I've said, that we only have evidence from maybe 10% of the continent at the moment in terms of fossils for human evolution. So the whole ancestry of Homo naledi is something that has yet to be discovered, and I don't think that will be the only big to come out of Africa. There may well be yet other species lurking in other parts of waiting.
Well, this may be a silly question, but if I came from the future, thousands of years, and I had a nice, perfectly preserved skeleton, from someone in China today, someone in the U.S., someone from Chile, someone from Australia, and I compared them, not knowing anything about this time period, what would I think that maybe is wrong versus what we know now? Like, how different would I think those specimens I found look, or would they look pretty much exactly the same?
Yeah, well, I think obviously modern humans show diversity. We come in different sizes and shapes and colors, and we know that there are some populations more bodied than others. So there is diversity. So anyone studying in the future has got to make an assessment of how much variation there will be with it to do when we put the fossils. But one thing all these modern humans show is a globular brain case. So that's distinctive features. And so all of these earlier humans I've talked about, long and low brain case. The brain is longer or lower. The top of the head is more flattened. They've usually got this great big brow at the front, Now, we're different. We stand away from all of them in having a much more globular brain. If you look at it from the side, it's evenly curved, and we have only tiny brow, in some cases no brow ridges at all. So we really stand out, and this observer in the future would notice modern human populations had that shared feature of a globular brain case and small brow ridges and a chin on the lower jaw. And if they looked at our rib cage and our pelvis, they again would see similarities, distinguished us, all of us, from those earliest, which had bigger rib cages, which had bigger lungs in them, and a pelvis was much wider and flared. So modern humans vary, but I would say it's variation on a pattern which is shared within the last, let's say, 250,000. So we have developed variation, but that variation is still within. I think an observer in the future, particularly if they also had the other fossils to look at, would see that we were set apart and we would justify a single species Homo sapiens. The problem comes, of course, as you trace these lineages. So, of course, as we head back to the common ancestor, Neanderthals and Denisovans, a common ancestor that may have lived maybe 600,000 years ago, as we go back in time, we will lose the features of the end of the lineage. The most derived features of humans would start to disappear as you go back in, and equally the most derived features of Neanderthals start to disappear until we get to a common ancestor, maybe 600,000, that would not look like a modern human. It would not look like a recent Neanderthal distinct, and modern human features on our lineage in Africa evolved along that time period over several hundred thousand. So a Homo sapiens fossil from 300,000 or 400,000 years ago will not have all. So that's when it gets to trace these lineages back in, because they change. They become less like their modern counterparts and more like the common.
Well, is there a way to map out who came first, who bred with who, et cetera? It sounds like there's big holes in our history. From what I know, like 10,000 BC was the first human settlements. I don't know if they found skeletons, but then there's this huge hole until about 40, 50,000 years ago where you find some of these fossils. And then, is that what it looks like? Like, what does the fossil record look like to you in terms of what we have and don't have?
Well, in some areas, we've got a reasonable record. So in Europe, there's a pretty good record. And also genetically, we have DNA now representing most of that time period, 40,000 years down to the present. So there we can talk about, a pretty good. But yes, when we look at a place like Africa, yes, in some regions, so in East Africa, there's some record. In Southern Africa, there's some record, but you're right. There are patches in the record with missing data. In China, we're starting to fill in some of those gaps in the last 1,000 years. In Australia, we have got, again, parts of that story for the last 40,000 years, but that's where we need more work, of course, and the genetic data can help flesh out those stories. So the genetic data tells us about interbreeding events. As I've mentioned, New Guineans, for example, have evidence of an interbreeding phase with Neanderthals happened probably around 55,000 years ago, and then they have an interbreeding phase with Denisovans that happened maybe 45. So you can map that in their DNA, even though we don't have the direct evidence. It does show in their DNA, and our interbreeding in Europe, the Neanderthals again can be mapped, most of it to about 55,000 years ago. So there were these phases of interbreeding. And what's interesting is because some people say, well, if we're interbreeding with Neanderthals and Denisovans, that's where we get these complex issues about what is a species. I think someone counted there were at least 35 ways to define a species. So the biological concept, which is the one I learned, says that species are reproductively isolated. They don't Now that concept is under challenge from the genetic data. The more genetic data we get of closely related species, the more we see that they do a bit of interbreeding. And this applies to groups of dogs, such as jackals and wolves, the domestic dog. It applies to horse species. It applies to baboon across Africa. They look like good species, these baboons. They have different appearance, behavior, and different environments. And yet when you look at where they overlap, they do a bit of interbreeding. And so this seems to be quite common. In bird species, it may be that 20% of closely related birds interbreed. And it looks like this is a way of species kind of topping up their diversity. By interbreeding with a closely related, you may acquire some lost diversity in pathway, and also you may acquire some useful adaptations from that other. So when we interbred with the Neanderthals, when we came out of Africa, we interbred with the Neanderthals, and they had their own immune adaptation to local pathogens, local diseases. Coming out of Africa, our ancestors didn't have any of that to the local diseases. And so by interbreeding with the Neanderthals, the result was that we got a quick fix to our immune system and acquired some of their immune defenses was advantageous. So that was the good side of breeding. When we look at the genomes of humans, there are places where there's accentuated bits of Neanderthal DNA, for example, in the immune system, but there's also deserts where all the Neanderthal DNA has been selected. And in those places, clearly it was disadvantageous to have in certain parts of the genome, and those were lost quite after the interbreeding. So when we look at modern fossils at 40,000 years ago in Europe, some of them have maybe old DNA from recent interbreeding, but very quickly the interbreeding level gets down. As you look at the generations, it goes down very quickly to around 2%, which is the level that we find across most of today.
Are there any, you said there's Denisovan DNA in like Southeast Asia. So what percentage of the population has it? And is it the same level as Neanderthals?
Yeah, so there's a much lower level of Denisovan DNA in most of East Asia. They have a very low percentage of Denisovan DNA, much less than 1%, but there are bits of it which seem to have proved useful. So, for example, in Tibet, it's been shown that a gene there which gives the ability to live at high altitude in low oxygen, that actually seems to have come from Denisovan. So some of these Tibetan populations have a gene that's been specially selected from that interbreeding with Denisovans, and it's been accentuated, and it helps populations live at high altitude. So that's an example of an advantage. But most of the Denisovan DNA has disappeared from those East Asian populations. There's a bit of it in Native Americans, originate East Asia. And when we move down to East Asia, Australasia, we see higher percentages of DNA there. So there's still a lot of work to do on it there. We think that some of the advantages of the Denisovan DNA may again be related to adaptations to local diseases. A lot of that research is still ongoing, and we don't really know what that Denisovan DNA in many cases is doing in modern humans. But I'm sure some of it will be advantageous, and that's what's still there.
Yeah. Last question. What do you think, or how much of a picture do we have of our common ancestor? And, what features would it have? When did it live? What's known about it?
So the common ancestor of us and Neanderthals and Denisovans, you're thinking of there?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I used to think this species, Homo heidelbergensis, species is around in Europe and Asia and Africa about 500,000 years ago. So for more than 30 years, I argued that it was very likely common ancestor. And in some ways it fits the bill because it's got a smaller brain than modern humans and Neanderthals. It's more primitive in terms of the size of the teeth, thickness of and so on. But the more I've studied this, and this is my own work, it seems that Heidelbergensis actually is derived in some way, and also it may be too young to be common ancestor. So recent data, looking back the date of that, probably 600,000 years ago, some people push it even further back. And Heidelbergensis seems to actually be largely younger than that age. So I was recently involved in some work dating a Heidelbergensis skull from Zambia, from Broken, one that we've got in them. And most people would have guessed that fossil was about 500,000 years old. But when we dated it, it turned out to be only 300,000 years old. So rather than being a candidate to be a modern human ancestor, it's probably only half the age of what we think it was. So certainly some Heidelbergensis are too late to common ancestors, and morphologically in the face, I think we're taking a different view of the evolution of the face now. So I used to take the view that Heidelbergensis face was halfway house between our very flat middle to the face with hollow cheekbones and the Neanderthals, big noses and inflated cheekbones and the whole middle of the face forwards. For me, Heidelbergensis seemed to sit between those, and it could go then in either direction, to a human face by reducing its size and to a Neanderthal face by making it more puffy. But we now take a different view that what we call the modern human face seems likely to be actually the primitive face. So it looks like the common ancestor actually had a face much more like ours, and it's the Neanderthals and Heidelbergensis that have moved away from that smaller, more delicate, because we've got a fossil from Spain of Homo antecessor, about 800. And the interesting thing with antecessor is that the fossil's face suggested rather a modern looking face, more than 800. And there are fossils in China that are 600,000 or so, about that age. They also seem to have so it looks like, we kept that face from the common ancestor, and the Neanderthals has moved on. So that's a different way of looking at it. So I would say the common ancestor had a face that looked much more like ours, but it would have had a big brow ridge, would have had a smaller brain, a thicker skull, probably a more robust skeleton.
Well, very good. Chris, what's the best way for people to find out more about your research and see pictures and everything? Where can they go?
Yeah, well, they can find me on Twitter in general. If I've got any papers or giving talks, they're on my Twitter feed. I've recently written a book with a colleague at the museum called Louise Humphrey. It's called Our Human Story. So that's certainly worth a look. And yes, I publish widely. I'm on things like your podcast. And find me if they do.
Excellent. Yeah, Chris, thanks for coming. It's a really interesting subject. And, I appreciate you being here.
Yeah, thank you.
If you like this podcast, please click the link in the description to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
You've been listening to the Finding Genius podcast with Richard Jacobs. If you like what you hear, be sure to review and subscribe to the Finding Genius podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. And want to be smarter than everybody else? Become a premium member at findinggeniuspodcast.com. This podcast is for information only. No advice of any kind is being given. Any action you take or don't take as a result of listening is your sole responsibility. Consult professionals when advice is needed.